I don't know whether you've realized this or not, but in a way, the Pokemon remake cycle has come full circle. Think about it. The series started on the original Game Boy. When Generation 3 rolled around, aka Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, it was on Game Boy Advance, and thus incompatible with the first two. I'm still pissed at that, and I'm not alone. But anyway, since the original Pokemon Red and Blue were obsolete, Nintendo remade them as Fire Red and Leaf Green on Game Boy Advance and in the graphical style of Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. That was a decade ago now. Recently, Ruby and Sapphire, originally seen as the template for how to remake other Pokemon games, have been remade themselves as Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire on the Nintendo 3DS. This begs the question, are we due for another remake of the Pokemon Generation 1 games anytime soon? It is a question I wish I'd never asked. But I did. I have a friend, we'll call him George, who, though I didn't know it at the time, works for Nintendo of America. Well, he said he does, but now I don't know what to believe. Anyway, I brought up the Pokemon remake cycle with George and how it made me wonder when we'd get another Pokemon Red and Blue remake, and he got a grin on his face and said, "That's interesting." But the grin didn't just look like an amused grin or even like a teasing grin, it almost looked mean. That was during my lunch break when I met him at a cafe, though, so we didn't get to talk much longer and I barely asked him about the grin. About a week and a half later, after that conversation, I got a simple and unassuming envelope in the mail from George to me. I didn't even make the connection to our conversation about Pokemon until I opened the envelope and saw the letter. It was only one single-sided page long, but the text was quite large, and instead of being typed, it was handwritten in what I, at the time, assumed was ruddy red ink. As I unfolded the letter, something fell out, but first I read it, to my nosy friend who thinks he's ahead of the game. It was then that I looked down and saw what fell out. It was a 3DS cartridge. It didn't have a logo in the way a retail game would, but there was a little price tag type sticker there that when I squinted to read said, Pokemon Blood Red. I was certain it was a joke, like George had stuck that on a blank cart, or maybe on a cart that was something else entirely, and I called him up on the phone, but it was just a message. I left a message telling him about it, asking him to call me back, but I didn't know when he would, so I figured I might as well play whatever was actually on that cartridge. When I stuck it into my 3DS and started it up, there was no special image for the game to start, just the words, "Found Game," in brackets. But I clicked to start anyway. Based on the company logos coming on screen, this was, in fact, a Pokemon game. But the title wasn't Blood Red, which didn't surprise me as I'd always suspected that was a joke. It was called Pokemon Red 20th Anniversary Edition, and I will admit, the intro screen impressed me. It was a classic bit with Snorlax and Nidoran fighting each other. But they were very well rendered and animated in 3D. I'll admit that I was actually a bit disturbed because when Nidoran prepared to pounce, it opened up its mouth, hissing and showing fangs that looked like they might have had some blood on them. But it went by too fast to tell. I wasn't dissuaded though, and started the game. In a lot of ways, this game was starting to feel less like a prank and more like a gift. Sure, George had put that stupid name on it, and given me a cryptically threatening-sounding letter, but the game itself was still good. The most notable thing about it was the graphics. Easily a step up from the other 3DS Pokemon games. They looked a bit more realistic for one thing. Pokemon had noticeable fur, scales, feathers, those sorts of features, and they had a lot more animations in battle, like dynamic moves, idle animations, that sort of thing. There were no chibi humans anymore either. All of the people had normal proportions, even in the overworld, and the same sort of detail little things you could see like muscles, ribs, fabric stitching, individual hairs. The terrain was better too. It looked like you were going through actual forests, towns, cities, etc., rather than the ugly utilitarian grids of the original. Yeah, I know I'm stepping on nostalgia here, but point is a point. When it got to the part where you first encountered Team Rocket, though, I gasped. If you've been with the series as long as I have, you probably remember that the original sprites for the Rocket Grunts had whips in their hands, but in every subsequent game, their sprites had been unarmed, even the Game Boy Advance remakes of the originals. In this new remake, the whips were not gone. That's something that I, as an adult and longtime fan, could appreciate in and of itself, but what was truly terrifying is that in this new high-definition 3-dimensional take on the game, the whips had blood on them. Not just a brief little hint like the beat around phase. The whips were constantly out and were drenching in it, and if it hadn't been dried, it would have been dripping. The worst part is that at one point I got into a conversation with one of these rocket grunts, and there was an option to initiate a dialogue with, "How did your whip get so bloody?" He said, "You can't expect me to remember all the moments, punk." This game wasn't fun or cool anymore. Its attention to detail and relative realism had taken a turn for the dreadful, but it was one of those things so dreadful one couldn't look away. So I played on, got what fun I could, and got all the way to Lavender Town. I really should have known better than to stay that course. When I entered the house where players heard that nostalgic but haunting conversation about Team Rocket killing the poor Cubo's mother, I couldn't help dreading how much worse it might be. The person didn't just talk about them killing Marowak, but went on, "She died making an awful sound like I now had made up my mind that this game was sick, and that it must never, ever find its way into the hands of poor young children. But I still kept on. Equipping my self-scope, I trudged up to Pokemon Tower, the ghosts attacking with what seemed like more aggression than I had known in the original game. Still, they weren't the worst part. No, the worst part was the environment itself. A far too ambient, dark, and decrepit place where sometimes blood dripped from the ceiling, and sometimes a slimy green substance that I believe it is called ectoplasm phased in as if from another dimension. It all could only mean that I was in for the worst yet when I reached the ghost Marowak. I got to the top, and the battle began. Or, I thought it did, but control was disabled. She emitted a hideous and then she raised her bone club in the air. Then, to my utter horror, she began to lick the bone. She licked the knob and licked it faster and faster, her fingers stroking it, and then she slid the knob of the bone into her mouth and began sucking. She sucked, and I saw the same green liquid I thought must be ectoplasm leaking from her nether regions. I hadn't even thought about whether I could control was enabled again. I just sat hypnotized at the realization of what I was watching. She plunged the bone deep into what only could be her vagina and let out a Then, as she worked the bony dildo, exhaling more and more, she rocked onto her back, and from her anus came the most horrific fart I have ever heard in the game. On and on it reverberated, until it briefly became muffled and out shot a slimy wad of Marowak feces. They spread out a bit as they hit what was supposed to be the interior of the screen, and there was dribbling from the Marowak's anus more and more like diarrhea. The lump of Marowak dung clung to the screen, obstructing the views at this point I thought to use the stylus. I rubbed across, trying to wipe it off, but it more smeared the stuff on supposedly the screen's interior than anything else. Just as I was finally done wiping more and more of it off, another projectile wad of it shot from the Marowak's anus and clung to the screen, even as she continued masturbating vigorously. It was at that point that I was broken from my trance by the phone ringing. I slammed my 3DS shut and answered, and it was George. "Did you get the present I got you from my employer?" he asked. "You mean Pokemon Blood Red, this sick thing?" I replied. "Blood Red?" asked George. "It's just a lovely HD remake." But the Pokemon Tower!" I shot back. "What about it?" asked George. "I thought it was normal." "You sick bastard!" I screamed. "Get your ass over here right now!" I hung up the phone. Hopefully George would come. Meanwhile, I was focused on something emanating from my 3DS. Smell. A horrible, ethereal smell. It smelled like